Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Yuan.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to the programme. So we have exactly 2 weeks to go and a barrage of new polls, all telling us, Yuan, pretty much the same story. Not just a Labour win, but a Labour landslide. YouGov's latest in-depth MRP poll says that the Tories are on course for their lowest seat tally in almost their 200-year history in terms of contesting British elections.
I'm wondering if we need a new word for beyond landslide. The YouGov poll says that Sunak's party will win just 108 seats if the election were being held today, down 32 from the same survey 2 weeks ago. It also registers a big jump in Lib Dem seats, projecting 67, and 5 seats for Reform, including Nigel Farage in Clacton.
OK, well, joining us to look then at the polling and much more is our Bloomberg UK Politics panel, featuring Alice Perry, former chair of Labour's National Executive Committee, Chris Wilkins, former speechwriter to Theresa May, and Luisa Porritt, the former Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament, back with us this week, as you have been throughout the campaigning. Things are hotting up. It's getting very exciting. Alice, this has very much been a caution first sort of approach from the Labour Party, I think. If the party gets a big majority in the way that we've just described in the polls, will it feel emboldened in government to deliver a much bigger agenda?
So if Labour win a lot of seats, then they'll have a mandate, but the mandate will be for the manifesto that they're elected on as well. And obviously, the more MPs you have, the better for being able to achieve your objectives. But also, it comes with it party management issues too. And I'm sure the whips will be very busy. But voting's begun now, and Labour will have a sense of what the results are likely to be from postal vote sampling or for the data they're collecting on the doorsteps. I'm just not sure I'm buying
200-seat majority. Won't be a bit less
I'm
caution.
just not sure that we're heading for a 200-seat majority at
150?
all. We'll see.
Blair size.
Yeah, could be, but honestly, it's so hard to predict voting behaviour post Brexit, and switches go all over the place. And something Labour have done a lot of focus groups with people who were Labour that switched to the Conservatives and UKIP. And one thing they found was at the time in 2015, 17 and 19, people were actively voting against Labour to punish them. And you're seeing a bit of that coming through in the polls now about the Conservatives, but we'll see. We'll get the result in 2 weeks' time. But I have a bet just with a Tory friend that Labour won't get more than 100 seats. I'm feeling like I might lose that one now, but we will see. I'm going to be very careful betting on politics.
Yes, more on that thought in just a moment. Chris, let me bring you in, though. So, as I say, final fortnight of campaigning, Conservatives heading for this historic loss, it would seem. Senior Conservatives, including the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, have pivoted to warning about Labour getting a supermajority. They're all but admitting defeat. How do you rate that as a strategy? Will it win anyone over?
It certainly are. I'm enjoying Alice's caution, by the way, of sort of Labour burned over the years about these things, so they're not getting carried away. But I think the polls are pretty clear. I think from the Tory point of view, there's been more people outspoken in the past sort of 24 hours about this. The Welsh Secretary, for example, David T.C. Davis, was pretty clear in an interview this week about he can see the polls, he can see how this is going, and then warning about this majority. I think their resignation set in quite some time ago in the Conservative Party. They've had their last sort of big moment, which was the manifesto launch. It sort of just came and went. It didn't really change anything, and people see where it's going. And so it is now about just trying to warn a really, really specific subset of voters about what a Labour government could bring, and those are Reform voters, essentially, the people who are flirting with Reform. And Reform have had Nigel Farage's return had massive impact on those MRP polls and on the Tory prospects. So the next 2 weeks in Tories are all about saying to people who are tempted to vote Reform, look, you're just going to give Keir Starmer very free rein and look at and warn you about all the things he's going to do. But that is literally the sort of only thing the Tories have left now, because I think it's clear they fired all their shots. And frankly, nothing is really changing.
Chris, is there a risk, though, with the wider electorate, though, that if the Tories are admitting defeat, all the polls say it's going to be terrible, that it just kind of emboldens people to sort of join in the kicking?
Yeah, it's a risky strategy. It really is. But, I think that they've got few other options at this stage. But all of the statistical evidence shows that that's the real problem. It is people who have given up on the Tories and are saying, actually, we're going after reform, we're going to vote for them. And that makes a huge difference in terms of the majority and the number of Tory seats. The MRP polls show quite a significant difference in the number of seats the Conservatives could get. And there is a massive difference between getting 65 seats, as one of the polls is suggesting, and sort of 140. So it's all about squeezing that reform vote. But yes, it does have a blowback, but they don't have any other option at this stage, I think.
Louisa, it looks like it's going to be the most politically diverse parliament in modern times. Reform, maybe a couple of Greens, Galloway's Workers' Party perhaps in with a shout. As an advocate of proportional representation, you must be excited to see all these far left and far right voices in Parliament.
I see where you're going with this, Yuan. Very good. Well, obviously, like other Liberal Democrats, I believe we should have PR, because then everybody's voice would count in elections in this country. And ultimately, I think that would lead to a lot more people feeling empowered and avoid some of the problems that we've actually seen transpire over recent years. I do think quite a lot of the votes to leave the EU was to do with many people having felt for many years that their vote never counted in any elections. And it was the first time, actually, you could send a message with your vote and have it count wherever you lived. I think it would be a good thing in the long run. And obviously, that's also the system that most other European countries have. It's a fairer system. And most of them manage to work it out, don't they? I know what you'll now say. Look at what's happening in France.
But more importantly, it may be that it's going to be a diverse parliament, but will any of those smaller parties really be able to stand up to, if we're talking landslide territory for Labour, actually it might be diverse, but those voices might be quashed. I mean, even your party's predicted to double or even treble its MP seats, but how are you going to be able to stand up to a Labour majority? I mean, we're comparing it to Blair. He had a 179 seat majority. Boris had 80. If the next Labour government potentially gets 150, 200, 250, how are the Lib Dems going to stand up to that?
Well, the Lib Dems are actually used to dealing with Labour supermajorities. Just ask any Lib Dem opposition groups in London on councils. So we've got good experience in that regard. And I think actually there will be quite a lot of the prospective MPs, if they do get elected, who have experience of working with and holding Labour to account, as well as the Conservatives.
So the councils have given you good experience, Louisa.
Alice, I want to ask you about the campaign in Scotland. John Swinney has launched the SNP's manifesto, clearly calling for a second independence referendum. And Labour's also been running quite a slick campaign about austerity, saying that Labour will be the same as the Tories in cutting public spending, because those are the figures the party's committed to. Do you worry that the SNP campaign is going to cut through?
Scotland's really interesting in terms of, often in the UK, in England, we think of just politics in an English lens, particularly as Labour. We haven't had any Scottish MPs really, apart from one there on his own. So it does. I think the two-child benefit cap obviously is something that's cutting through, and it's a different political, and it'll be different when you've actually got a cohort of Scottish MPs re-elected again, if Labour manages to do that, if they could win 20 or 30 seats. But Scottish politics is different, and the party really suffered in terms of it never had the membership increase that happened elsewhere in Wales and England during Corbyn, and has been kind of starved of resources. That they had a very brutal independence referendum, and it took Labour a long time to find their voice and their place and work out what they really stood for in Scotland. But I think Anas Sarwar's got a very powerful platform, and they've done a lot of thinking and soul searching. So the fact that they're, it looks like they could win 20 or 30 seats in Scotland. And earlier, before these polls, you were thinking that those were 20 seats you didn't have to win in England. But it's quite interesting to think what then happens if you've got a massive majority just in England, and like what happens to those Scottish voices and what that means as well. But the tax system in Scotland's really interesting too, and Labour are opposing the SNP increases in income tax for the bands over 70k, I think it is. And actually the SNP mismanagement of the finances and that massive black hole they had and the unfunded council tax stuff also is going to be an important factor. And it's quite interesting seeing Labour place the Conservatives in London and the SNP as like two parties that have just made a mess, and it's time for change. And at the end of the day, whatever the polls say, if you want change, you have to vote for it.
So that's on the nations and regions. I mean, I think it'll be very interesting, as you say, to see what the balance is and what the thinking is about how centralised Labour is, if indeed it does win in the general election. But there's another point that we mentioned in terms of betting. The Conservative Party's director of campaigns apparently is taking a leave of absence because of the allegations around betting on the date of the general election. This is Tony Lee. Chris, I want to come to you on this. It also comes, of course, as you've got a lot of Tory leaders positioning themselves this week. They seem to be more campaigning for themselves than anybody else. Cleverly, Badenoch, Tugendhat, to name just three. Is the campaign just falling apart now?
Oh, look, honestly, there essentially isn't really a Conservative campaign at this point. The mood in Conservative campaign headquarters is just beyond dire. I think people aren't even really particularly going in. Obviously, the departure of the director of campaigning, it sounds slightly more important than it is in terms of this. There's an outside team who are really running the campaign. But it just feeds into this narrative that basically the party has somehow given up, and it just damages morale further. What is interesting, as you say, all eyes have turned to really what happens next, and you've got a few MPs who might actually keep their seats, who would be in the running with the leadership, people like Tom Tugendhat, people like Priti Patel, for example, who are actually spending a lot of time campaigning in other people's seats in this election now, because their seats are pretty safe. So they're out helping colleagues, I'm sure generously and selflessly doing so, but obviously positioning themselves for what comes next. And really, in the Conservative Party now, that is the conversation. What actually happens on 5th of July? Who comes next? All eyes have turned there because, to be honest, the central campaign, it's not worked. People have slightly sort of now doing their own thing.
Louisa, I want to ask you on a happier note for your party. YouGov's now projecting 67 seats, including many that the party's probably not targeting at all. Can the party really afford to ignore all these seats and stick to the probably smaller number that it was planning to target in the first place?
It's a great question, Yuan, and you'll remember me talking previously about my cautious optimism and how overexcitement can sometimes lead to the Liberal Democrats shooting themselves in the foot by over-targeting too many seats. It's so unpredictable in this election, as we've discussed, because we just don't know the actual extent of the Tory vote collapse, which is bringing a whole load of other seats into play that weren't on the kind of top target seat list at the beginning of the election. But there has always been kind of a second and third tier of seats that we knew were potentially winnable in this election. And I think what we'll probably see in practice is there are always surprises on election night, right? So there might be a few that were thought to be bolted on that aren't actually successful, but then there will be ones on that second tier where MPs do get elected that weren't initially ones where we were expecting to elect MPs. So, you know, how that will actually play out in terms of numbers, I think is really hard to tell. There's huge variance in those MRPs. And I would also just add that MRPs aren't actually great at predicting what will happen in individual seats. They extrapolate overall numbers, but it's really important to dig into the detail of them to see how much they can actually be trusted. Certainly when I look a lot of them at the individual projections, I think, well, that one looks about right. That looks pretty off to me. So just everyone should approach it with an element of caution.
Okay. caution. Louisa, thank you so much for being with us. Luisa Porritt, former Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament, and also to Alice Perry, former chair of Labour's National Executive Committee, and Chris Wilkins, the former speechwriter to Theresa May. I mean, does, for all the caution, look like the polling is actually very, very steady. We shall see if anything changes in the next couple of weeks. I mean, in the past, of course, a lot has come down to the very last few days of campaigning. So let's see if anything changes.
Yeah, I think it would have to be an earthquake of polling mess up for it to be completely wrong. But as you say, there are still 2 weeks left to go.
Yeah. That's it from us for today. Now, next week, I should say that on Monday, Bloomberg is going to be hosting a live debate between Labour and Conservative top voices on business. Jonathan Reynolds and Kemi Badenoch will be joining us. You can tune in on radio and TV at 12:30pm London time. We will also be putting out that debate on Bloomberg UK Politics too.
Yeah, that should be good. This episode was produced by James Walcock and our audio engineer was Sean Gostamacchia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more next week. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.